Have you ever stared down a $500 fine because your house numbers were allegedly written in the wrong font? I don't mean a polite warning or a sticky note left on your door by a well-meaning neighbor. I mean a certified, legally threatening heavy stock paper demand for $500 because the number 2 on your mailbox lacked the appropriate serifs. Because I have. And let me tell you, standing in the blistering midday sun of Cary, North Carolina, holding a piece of paper that practically vibrated with bureaucratic malice, is a very specific kind of out-of-body experience. Cary is one of those suburbs that doesn't just strive for perfection. It legally mandates it under threat of financial ruin. It's the kind of place where the grass isn't just green, it's a specific, mathematically verified shade of emerald that requires a chemical cocktail that probably violates the Geneva Conventions to maintain. The sidewalks are power-washed weekly. The trees look like they were pruned by a laser level. If a stray leaf has the audacity to fall onto a driveway, I swear to God, 3 different residents get an alert on their phones. It is a sterile, terrifying utopia, and I had somehow managed to become public enemy number 1. The envelope was thick, off-white, and sealed with a sticker bearing the embossed logo of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I hadn't even opened it yet, and I could already feel my blood pressure spiking. I leaned against my mailbox, a regulation-approved beige cast aluminum receptacle on a 4x4 pressure-treated post, and ripped the flap open. There it was. A notice of severe infraction and immediate penalty. I blinked, the glare of the sun reflecting off the aggressively bright white paper. I read the first paragraph, then I read it again, assuming the heat was giving me a stroke. It explicitly stated that my property was in direct violation of the Uniform Aesthetic Reflectivity Standard. Subsection 4A, paragraph 9. The crime? The brass numbers I had screwed into the wooden post of my mailbox 3 years ago had begun to naturally oxidize. They were no longer gleaming like the bumper of a 1950s Cadillac. And worse, as the letter so helpfully pointed out with an attached, heavily zoomed-in, grainy photograph taken from the bushes across the street, my numbers were in an Arial-style font. The Whispering Pines bylaws strictly dictated that all identifying numerature must be in Times New Roman, completely untarnished, and possess a reflectivity coefficient that could blind a low-flying aircraft. $500, payable within 48 hours, or the fine would double every single day the atrocity remained unrectified. I looked down at the brass numbers. The 2, the 0, and the 8. They looked perfectly fine. They looked like house numbers. They did not look like an affront to God and real estate values. I didn't even bother walking back into my house. I just turned on my heel and started marching down the perfectly straight, entirely debris-free sidewalk toward the HOA clubhouse. My flip-flops smacked aggressively against the concrete. I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood watch on me. Susan from across the street was definitely peeking through her plantation shutters, her hand probably hovering over the speed dial for the private security patrol. I didn't care. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of a $500 fine for slightly dull brass had flipped a switch in my brain. The Whispering Pines clubhouse was a monument to suburban excess. It had Greek columns, a fountain that continuously cycled water that smelled faintly of chlorine, and a set of heavy double doors that looked like they belonged on a bank vault. I pushed my way inside, the blast of hyper-chilled air conditioning immediately freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. The interior smelled like potpourri and absolute authority. And sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, acting as the gatekeeper to this realm of aesthetic tyranny, was Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president. She wore a pastel pink cardigan draped over her shoulders, tied neatly at the neck, despite the fact that it was 95 degrees outside. Her hair was sprayed into a helmet of impenetrable blonde waves. In front of her sat a clipboard, a meticulously organized array of colored highlighters, and a small placard that read, "Harmony through compliance." She didn't look up when I walked in. She was aggressively typing on her keyboard with her 2 index fingers, the acrylic nails clicking like a metronome. I walked up to the desk and slapped the thick, off-white paper down onto the polished mahogany. It made a highly satisfying, heavy thud. Brenda slowly stopped typing. She took a deep, theatrical breath, adjusted her glasses, and finally looked up at me with an expression of performative exhaustion. "Jack," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How lovely to see you. I imagine you're here to drop off your certified check." "Brenda," I started, keeping my voice remarkably level, considering I wanted to rip the fountain out of the front lawn and throw it through the window. "What is this?" She glanced at the paper, then back at me, her smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. "That is a notice of severe infraction, Jack. I would think the bold, red lettering at the top would have made that clear. We've had several complaints." "Complaints?" I asked, leaning slightly over the desk. "From who? The font police? The metallurgy division of the FBI?" "Sarcasm isn't going to fix your mailbox, Jack," she said, picking up a pink highlighter and tapping it against her clipboard. "The community covenants are very clear. We all signed the same documents when we moved into Whispering Pines. We all agreed to uphold the visual integrity of the neighborhood. Your mailbox numbers are a blight." "A blight," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Brenda, they are brass numbers. They have been there for 3 years. They are slightly less shiny than they were in 2023. This is a $500 fine for a natural chemical reaction. The bylaws state that all exterior metal fixtures must maintain an as-new appearance," she recited, entirely from memory, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of bureaucracy. "Furthermore, and perhaps more egregiously, your numbers are sans serif. Arial, specifically, if my research is correct. Whispering Pines is a Times New Roman community, Jack. Arial is, well, it's industrial. It's cheap. It lowers the perceived value of the entire street." I stared at her. I literally searched her face for any sign of a joke, a smirk, a flicker of humanity. There was nothing. She was dead serious. She genuinely believed that a font choice on a mailbox was eroding the fabric of society. "Times New Roman," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Correct," she nodded, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "Brenda, I bought these numbers at the hardware store down the street. They are standard numbers. You can read them from a moving car. The mailman has never once been confused about where I live." "The Postal Service's low standards are not Whispering Pines standards," she countered smoothly. "You have 48 hours, Jack. After that, the fine becomes $1,000. The day after that, $2,000. I strongly suggest you visit a specialized hardware boutique and rectify the situation immediately." "And if I just take them off?" I challenged, crossing my arms. "If I just remove the blight entirely?" Brenda's smile finally reached her eyes, and it was terrifying. She reached over to a thick, leather-bound binder resting on the corner of her desk. It was the Whispering Pines Master Covenant. She flipped it open to a page marked with a neon yellow sticky note. "Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 1, she read aloud, her voice ringing out in the empty clubhouse lobby. "Identification must be clearly visible from the street at all times. Failure to display approved addressing will result in an immediate and non-negotiable safety violation fine of $1,000, compounding daily. We take emergency responder visibility very seriously here, Jack. I stood there, processing the trap she had built. If I left the slightly dull aerial numbers up, I owed $500, compounding. If I took them down to buy time while I searched for blindingly shiny Times New Roman numbers, I owed $1,000, compounding. She had me, and she knew it. So, Brenda said, closing the massive binder with a heavy thud that echoed the one my letter had made earlier. I expect to see gleaming serifed digits by Thursday morning, or I expect a very large check. Have a harmonious day, Jack. I didn't say another word. There was no point. Arguing with Brenda was like trying to punch water. It just splashed back in your face and made you look stupid. I picked up the violation letter, crumpled it slightly in my fist, and walked out of the clubhouse. The heat hit me like a physical wall as I stepped back outside, but my mind was entirely somewhere else. I wasn't just angry anymore. The initial hot flash of rage had cooled into something much more dangerous, a cold, hyper-focused obsession. I wasn't going to pay the fine. I wasn't going to buy Times New Roman numbers. I was going to find a way to make Brenda deeply, profoundly regret ever learning the word serif. I walked back to my house in a daze, ignoring Susan, who was now explicitly standing on her front porch pretending to water a plastic fern just to watch me. I went straight into my home office, locked the door, and booted up my computer. I needed to read the enemy's playbook. I logged into the Whispering Pines resident portal and downloaded the complete 400-page Homeowners Association Master Covenant. For the next 6 hours, I didn't move. I didn't eat. I barely blinked. I read through the most mind-numbing, micromanaged nonsense ever put to paper by a human being. I discovered that bird baths were strictly regulated and could only contain distilled water to prevent mineral buildup on the basin. I learned that you could only open your garage door for a maximum of 15 consecutive minutes unless a vehicle was actively traversing the threshold. I found out that holiday lights could only be warm white, never cool white, and absolutely never colored, under penalty of a $200 daily fine. It was madness. It was a manifesto written by people who were terrified of the chaos of the natural world. But I wasn't looking for the crazy rules. I was looking for the sloppy ones. I was looking for the exact phrasing regarding house numbers. Because if there is one thing I've learned from dealing with self-important bureaucrats, it's that they are arrogant. They write rules assuming nobody will ever actually read them, which means they leave holes. Massive, gaping, technical loopholes. Around 8 p.m., my eyes burning from the glow of the monitor, I finally found it. Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 2. I read it out loud to the empty room. Address numbers must be displayed on the primary dwelling facade or integrated into the front landscaping. I stopped. I read it again. Or integrated into the front landscaping. I quickly hit Ctrl+F on my keyboard and searched the document for the word landscaping. I read every single definition, every single clause. The bylaws had pages and pages dictating the types of shrubs allowed, the exact height of the grass, the permitted colors of mulch. But there was absolutely no definition, no restriction, and no methodology listed for how an address should be integrated into that landscaping. No font requirements were listed for landscaping integration. No material requirements. No size limits. Brenda had fixated entirely on the dwelling facade part of the rule when she went on her Times New Roman crusade. She forgot about the dirt. A slow, terrible smile spread across my face. But I needed an ironclad defense. If I did what I was currently contemplating, Brenda would attempt to scorch the earth and take my house. I needed a shield bigger than the HOA. I needed municipal law. I opened a new tab and pulled up the official city code for Cary, North Carolina. I bypassed the zoning laws and went straight for the heavy machinery: emergency services. I clicked into the local adoptions of the International Fire Code. And there it was, shining like a beacon of absolute legal invincibility. International Fire Code, IFC, Section 5.05.1, Premises Identification. I leaned closer to the screen, practically vibrating with excitement. The code explicitly stated that new and existing buildings shall have approved address numbers, building numbers, or approved building identification placed in a position that is plainly legible and visible from the street or road fronting the property. These numbers shall contrast with their background. Address numbers shall be Arabic numerals or alphabet letters. And then the kicker. I cross-referenced this with North Carolina state law regarding the preemption doctrine. It is a fundamental legal principle that dictates when a higher level of government passes a law, it overrides any conflicting lower-level rules. Emergency and fire safety codes are matters of public safety. They legally, unequivocally override private HOA aesthetic covenants, as if numbers were highly visible, contrasting, and aided emergency responders. The fire code protected them. And the fire code did not care about serifs. It did not care about oxidized brass. It cared about visibility, extreme visibility. I leaned back in my office chair and stared at the ceiling. Integrated into the landscaping, I whispered to myself. The HOA wanted clear identification. The fire marshal wanted high-contrast visibility. And I wanted revenge. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Mike. Mike owned a local landscaping and hardscaping company. He was a massive, bearded guy who communicated almost entirely in exhausted sighs and heavy sarcasm. He hated HOAs more than anyone I knew, mostly because Brenda had once successfully fined his company for parking a mulch truck 3 inches over the curb while he was working on a neighbor's yard. It was late, but Mike picked up on the second ring. The sound of a loud television played in the background. "Yeah," Mike grunted into the receiver. "Mike, it's Jack." "Jack? Your grass is fine. I'm not coming out there to look at a brown spot at 9 o'clock at night." "I don't have a brown spot, Mike," I said, unable to keep the manic energy out of my voice. "I have a project. A big project. A very specific, highly visible project." Mike paused. The television volume in the background went down. "What kind of project?" "I need to integrate my house numbers into my front landscaping," I explained, quoting the bylaw. "And I need it done tomorrow, before noon." "Buy a rock," Mike sighed. "Paint the numbers on a rock. Put it in the mulch. That's $100. I'll drop it off." "No, Mike, you aren't listening. I need a 2, a 0, and an 8. And I need them to be 12 feet tall, each. I want them spanning the entire width of my front yard." Dead silence on the other end of the line. For a solid 10 seconds, all I heard was Mike breathing. 12 feet tall, Mike finally repeated, his voice flat. "Yes." "In Whispering Pines?" "Yes." "Brenda's neighborhood?" "Exactly." I could practically hear the gears turning in Mike's head. I knew the exact moment the realization hit him. "Jack," Mike said slowly, "if I paint 12-foot numbers on your grass, the HOA will have an aneurysm, and then the paint will wash away in 3 days when the sprinklers run, and you'll be out whatever I charge you for the labor." "I don't want paint, Mike," I said. "Paint is temporary. Paint is messy. Paint isn't a permanent integration into the landscape." "So what? You want me to dig out the shape of the numbers and fill it with white gravel? That's going to take 3 guys 2 days. We have to cut the sod, haul the dirt, lay down weed fabric." "Too slow," I interrupted. "Brenda gave me a 48-hour deadline. We need something faster, something bolder, something with extreme, high-contrast visibility that cannot be undone." Another long pause. "Jack," Mike said, and for the first time, there was a hint of genuine amusement in his gruff voice. "Are you asking me to use the Dragon?" The Dragon was Mike's commercial-grade, heavy-duty propane weed burner. It was essentially a roofing flamethrower attached to a massive rolling tank. He usually used it to instantly vaporize heavy brush and invasive weeds on large commercial lots. It produced a focused 3-foot column of blue flame that burned at nearly 3,000 degrees. "I am asking," I said, a massive grin plastered on my face, "if you are legally licensed to perform controlled agricultural weed abatement on private property." Mike let out a low, booming chuckle. "I am. Fully insured, too. And if, during that routine weed abatement, the path of your equipment just so happened to trace out the exact shape of my address numbers into the Bermuda grass, well, that's just an integrated landscaping choice, isn't it?" "It's going to scorch the earth, Jack," Mike warned, though he sounded entirely on board. "It will carbonize the soil. Nothing is going to grow back there in those exact shapes for months, maybe a year. It's going to be a permanent black scar on the most perfect lawn in Cary." "High contrast," I replied. "Excellent for emergency visibility. IFC 505.1 compliance. Brenda is going to call the cops." "I'm counting on it." Mike sighed, but it was a happy sigh. "I'll be there at 10 a.m. I've got some old fire-retardant welding blankets we can cut up to make the stencils. Keep the lines crisp." "What's this going to cost me?" I asked. "For the pleasure of watching Brenda's head explode on her own front lawn?" Mike asked. "Half price. See you tomorrow, Jack." He hung up. I set the phone down on my desk. I looked back at the computer monitor, at the glowing text of the fire code and the glaring omission in the HOA covenant. I had been handed a $500 ultimatum over the shape of a piece of metal. They wanted me to bow down to their aesthetic tyranny. They wanted me to fear the clipboard. Instead, I was going to bring fire to Whispering Pines. I barely slept that night. I kept running the plan over and over in my head, anticipating every move Brenda would make, every threat she would throw. By the time the sun came up, casting long, perfect shadows across the aggressively manicured lawns of my neighborhood, I was practically buzzing with adrenaline. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the deep, rumbling growl of a heavy-duty diesel engine echoed down the quiet street. I walked out onto my front porch holding a mug of black coffee. Mike's massive Ford F-350 pulled up to my curb. The truck was battered, covered in a fine layer of dust, and stood out like a sore thumb among the pristine Lexuses and Teslas parked in the surrounding driveways. Attached to a trailer hitch on the back was a heavy steel cart carrying a massive white propane cylinder. Coiled around it was a thick black hose attached to a wand that looked like a weapon from a sci-fi movie. Mike stepped out of the truck. He was wearing heavy steel-toe boots, thick denim jeans, and a faded t-shirt. He dragged a massive heavy canvas bag out of the bed of the truck and dumped it onto my driveway. "Morning," he grunted, pulling on a pair of thick leather welding gloves. "Beautiful day for some landscaping, Mike," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Let's get this over with before the cavalry arrives," he said, unzipping the bag. He pulled out 3 massive sheets of heavy, dark gray welding fabric. He had clearly spent the morning cutting them. When he laid them out on my driveway, the sheer scale of the project finally hit me. The stencils were enormous. The 2 alone was easily 12 feet tall and maybe 6 feet wide. The lines were sharp, blocky, and incredibly thick. "Arial font?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Times New Roman is too hard to cut out with shears," Mike said deadpan. "Plus, I figured you'd appreciate the irony." "You are an artist, Mike." We dragged the heavy fire-retardant blankets onto the pristine, perfectly green expanse of my front lawn. My yard was fairly large for the neighborhood, sloping gently down toward the street. It was a perfect canvas. We positioned the numbers side by side, 2, 0, 8. They took up almost the entire yard, leaving only a few feet of green grass around the borders. I looked down the street. Susan's blinds were already twitching. She was definitely on the phone. We had maybe 10 minutes before the HOA private security patrol showed up, and maybe 15 before Brenda herself arrived to enforce the peace. "Ready?" Mike asked. He walked over to the trailer, turned a heavy brass valve on the propane tank, and grabbed the long metal wand. He walked back onto the grass, stepping carefully onto the fire blanket stencil for the 2. "Light it up," I said. Mike pulled a striker from his pocket and held it near the nozzle of the wand. He squeezed the trigger. Whoosh! The sound was incredible. It wasn't just a fire, it was a jet engine roaring to life in the middle of a quiet suburb. A massive, terrifying column of bright blue and orange flame erupted from the wand, slamming into the exposed grass in the center of the stencil. The heat hit my face instantly, a dry, intense wave of thermal energy. The smell followed a second later, the sharp, acrid scent of instantly vaporized moisture, followed by the heavy, smoky odor of carbonizing organic matter. Mike moved methodically. He wasn't just burning the grass, he was erasing it from existence. He swept the roaring flame back and forth within the confines of the stencil. The bright, emerald-green Bermuda grass curled, blackened, and turned to ash in less than a second. Underneath the grass, the top layer of soil began to bake, turning a deep, rich charcoal black. It was loud. It was incredibly loud. A few doors down, a man dropped his briefcase on his driveway and just stood there, staring open-mouthed at the spectacle. A woman jogging with a golden retriever stopped dead in her tracks, pulling the terrified dog back from the roaring sound. Mike finished the 2 in less than 3 minutes. He cut the gas, the flame dying with a sharp pop. We dragged the heavy stencil off to the side. I looked down at the lawn. It was glorious. Cut perfectly into the vibrant green grass was a massive 12-foot-tall, pitch-black number 2. The contrast was violent. It looked like the grass had been branded by a giant. The edges were razor-sharp, thanks to the welding blanket. The exposed, carbonized soil stood out like a beacon. "One down," Mike grunted, not even pausing to admire his work. He dragged the stencil for the 0 into place and fired up the wand again. Whoosh! By the time he started on the 8, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk across the street. People in golf attire, women in tennis skirts, all standing in stunned silence, watching a man with a flamethrower systematically obliterate a perfectly manicured lawn. I could hear snippets of conversation floating over the roar of the burner. Is he insane? Call the police! My God, the property values. I just smiled, taking another sip of my coffee. I waved politely at Susan, who was practically hyperventilating on her porch. Mike cut the gas for the final time. The roaring stopped, leaving a ringing silence in the neighborhood, broken only by the crackle of the freshly baked earth. We pulled the last stencil away. I walked down to the street and turned around to look at my house. The numbers 208 were seared into the earth. They were massive. They were black as pitch against the bright green grass. You could probably read them from a low-flying commercial airliner. They were the most aggressive, undeniable house numbers in the history of residential zoning. "Well," Mike said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his heavy glove, "that's integrated." Before I could respond, the screech of tires echoed down the block. A heavily branded electric golf cart bearing the Whispering Pines logo came tearing around the corner, taking the curve on 2 wheels. It was Brenda. She slammed on the brakes, the golf cart skidding to a halt right in front of my driveway. She didn't even turn off the key. She just practically vaulted out of the driver's seat, her face a terrifying shade of magenta. Her pink cardigan was slipping off one shoulder. She was clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles were white. "Jack!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at the scorched earth. "What have you done? What is this?" I took a slow, deliberate step forward, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. I smiled. "Good morning, Brenda," I said brightly. "I'm just complying with the notice of severe infraction you issued yesterday. Remember? You demanded I fix the address visibility issue. I reviewed the bylaws, specifically Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 2, and decided to integrate my numbers into the front landscaping." Brenda stared at the massive black numbers. Her mouth opened and closed silently a few times like a fish gasping for air. You burned your lawn," she finally sputtered, her voice barely a whisper. "You destroyed the aesthetic integrity of the entire block. This is vandalism. This is arson. I am calling the police. I am calling the fire department. You are going to jail, Jack." "Actually, Brenda," Mike chimed in, leaning casually against his truck and crossing his massive arms, "this is routine, contracted, agricultural weed abatement, fully permitted. The fact that the abatement resulted in numerical shapes is purely coincidental to the landscaping design." Brenda whipped around to glare at him. "You! I fined you last year. You're an accomplice to this terrorism." She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and aggressively dialed 911. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Hello? Police?" she screamed into the phone. "Yes, I am the president of the Whispering Pines HOA. I need officers immediately. One of our residents has gone insane. He hired a man with a flamethrower to burn his property. He's destroying the neighborhood. Send everyone." She hung up and glared at me, panting heavily. "You're done, Jack. The fines for this will reach into the tens of thousands. We will put a lien on your house. We will foreclose on you. You will lose everything." I just took a slow sip of my coffee. "Brenda, I highly recommend you take a deep breath. You're going to give yourself a heart attack over some dirt." We didn't have to wait long. Cary's emergency services pride themselves on rapid response times, especially when a frantic resident reports a man with a flamethrower. Less than 5 minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air. 2 Cary police cruisers came flying down the street, their light bars flashing, pulling up aggressively behind Mike's truck. Right behind them was a massive red fire department SUV. Doors flew open. 2 police officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. A fire marshal wearing a white shirt and a heavy canvas jacket stepped out of the SUV, carrying a clipboard of his own. Brenda practically sprinted toward them. "Officers, Thank God you're here. Arrest him. Arrest them both. Look at what they did." She gestured wildly toward my lawn. The officers looked at the lawn. They looked at the massive blackened numbers. They looked at Mike, who was calmly unhooking the propane wand, and then they looked at me, standing on my driveway holding a coffee mug. The older officer, a guy whose name tag read Davis, sighed heavily. He had the distinct look of a man who dealt with HOA disputes entirely too often. "Sir," Officer Davis said, walking toward me, "can you explain what's going on here? We got a call about arson and a flamethrower." "Good morning, officer," I said calmly. "No arson here. As you can see, the house is perfectly intact. I simply hired a licensed contractor to perform some highly targeted weed control on my lawn. We used a standard commercial propane burner. The fire is completely extinguished." Officer Davis looked back at the giant 208. "Targeted weed control in the shape of your address." "Yes, sir," I nodded earnestly. "My Homeowners Association issued me a severe penalty yesterday because they claimed my previous house numbers were not visible enough. I take community safety very seriously, so I decided to make sure my address was integrated directly into the landscaping, per their exact written guidelines." Brenda was vibrating with rage. "He's lying! He's mocking the rules! This is a malicious destruction of property!" The fire marshal, a stern-looking man named Henderson, walked past the police officers and stood at the edge of my driveway, staring down at the scorched numbers. He squinted, tilting his head slightly. "Marshal," Brenda pleaded, rushing up to him, "you have to cite him for an illegal burn. He created a massive fire hazard. He endangered the entire street." Marshal Henderson slowly turned his head to look at Brenda. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly confused. "Ma'am," Henderson said, his voice slow and methodical, "did you say you fined this man because his address wasn't visible enough?" "Yes," Brenda confirmed proudly. "His numbers were oxidized and entirely the wrong font. They were a safety hazard." Henderson looked back at the lawn. "And you demanded he fix it immediately?" "Yes, under threat of compounding daily fines." Henderson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital camera. He snapped a picture of the giant, scorched 208. Then he turned back to me. "Sir," the marshal asked, "why black?" This was the moment. This was the pivot. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a neatly folded, perfectly highlighted printout of the municipal code. "Well, Marshal," I said, unfolding the paper and stepping forward to hand it to him. "I was reading up on the International Fire Code, specifically Section 505.1 regarding premises identification, as adopted by the city of Cary." Henderson took the paper, glancing down at it. He already knew the code, obviously, but he read the highlighted section anyway. "It dictates," I continued loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd of neighbors could hear every word, "that address numbers must contrast with their background and be plainly legible and visible from the street. I figured nothing contrasts better with bright green grass than carbonized, pitch-black earth. And at 12 feet tall, I believe I have far exceeded the minimum visibility requirements for emergency responders." Henderson looked from the paper to the lawn, and then to Brenda. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "He's right," Henderson said flatly. Brenda froze. The color drained out of her face, leaving her a sickly shade of gray. "What?" "He's right," Henderson repeated, raising his voice slightly. "Under IFC 505.1, this property is in perfect compliance with emergency identification codes. In fact, this is probably the most visible address in the entire county. If there's an emergency here at 3 a.m., my trucks aren't going to miss it." But the aesthetic integrity," Brenda stammered. "The HOA covenant. He violated the visual harmony rules." Henderson handed the paper back to me. "Ma'am, I am a fire marshal. I enforce state and municipal safety codes. I do not enforce HOA visual harmony rules. And under the doctrine of legal preemption, state safety codes regarding premise identification supersede private covenant aesthetic restrictions." He turned to Officer Davis. "No fire hazard here. Controlled burn, safely executed, fully extinguished. He's technically improving emergency response times." Officer Davis nodded, clearly trying to suppress a smile. He turned to Brenda. "Ma'am," Officer Davis said, his tone suddenly very stern. "This is a civil dispute over landscaping. It is not an emergency. It is not arson. I strongly suggest you do not call 911 again unless there is an actual crime in progress, or I will cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system." Brenda looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She looked at the cops. She looked at the fire marshal. She looked at the giant scorched numbers on my lawn. And finally, she looked at me. I smiled, took the last sip of my coffee, and raised the empty mug toward her. "Have a harmonious day, Brenda," I said. The silence that followed Officer Davis's warning was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was a thick, heavy, suffocating silence that completely blanketed the cul-de-sac. The only noise was the gentle, rhythmic popping of the cooling metal on Mike's propane wand and the faint rustle of the wind blowing across my freshly carbonized front lawn. Brenda did not move. She literally looked like someone had hit the pause button on her nervous system. She just stared at the empty space where the police cruisers had been parked, her mouth slightly ajar, the pink cardigan now fully sliding off her shoulder and dangling limply from her elbow. The power she wielded, the absolute, unquestionable authority she used to terrorize retired couples over the shade of their porch lights, had just been legally completely dismantled by a guy in a dirty t-shirt and a fire marshal who couldn't have cared less about her clubhouse rules. Mike let out a low, rumbling chuckle that broke the spell. He tossed the welding gloves into the bed of his massive Ford F-35, the heavy leather slapping against the metal. "Well," Mike said, his voice echoing in the quiet street, "I'd say that was a highly successful abatement. The soil is sterilized. You won't see a weed or a blade of grass in those specific numerical zones until at least next spring. Good doing business with you, Jack." "Worth every penny, Mike," I replied, not taking my eyes off Brenda. "Send me the invoice. I might frame it." Mike climbed into the cab of his truck, the massive diesel engine roaring to life with a sound that made Susan, still watching from her porch across the street, visibly flinch. He threw it into gear, gave a sharp, two-finger salute out the window, and rolled away, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust that drifted lazily over my blackened lawn. I turned my attention back to the HOA president. "So," I said, leaning casually against my mailbox post, the very post that had started this entire absurd saga, "are we good here? Or do you want to break out the tape measure and verify the kerning on the zero? Because I'm pretty sure Mike eyeballed it, and I wouldn't want to be cited for disproportionate geometric scaling." Brenda finally snapped out of her trance. Her eyes darted from the scorched earth to my face, and the sheer level of venom in her glare could have stripped the paint off a car. She didn't say a word. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten me with foreclosure. She just spun around, her sensible flats scraping harshly against the asphalt, and marched back to her branded golf cart. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slammed her foot onto the accelerator, and sped off down the street, the electric motor whining in high-pitched protest. I watched her go, until she turned the corner out of sight. I took a deep breath, the faint smell of roasted Bermuda grass filling my lungs. It smelled like victory. It smelled like malicious compliance, but I knew this wasn't over. You don't just publicly humiliate the dictator of a suburban fiefdom and expect them to quietly retreat to their aggressively beige living room. A wounded HOA board is a dangerous thing. They operate entirely on ego, and I had just taken a massive 12-foot-tall flamethrower to theirs. I walked back into my house, locked the door, and went straight to my home office. I needed to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. I knew Brenda couldn't use the police anymore. She couldn't use the fire department. The city had officially washed their hands of the situation, legally classifying my lawn as a triumph of public safety. That left her with only one weapon, the HOA bureaucratic machine. She was going to try to drag me into their kangaroo court. For the next 4 hours, my phone did not stop buzzing. The Whispering Pines private Facebook group, a digital cesspool usually reserved for complaining about stray cats and mildly suspicious delivery drivers, had absolutely exploded. Someone, probably Susan, had posted a wide-angle photograph of my house from across the street. The caption read, "Terrorism on Oak Creek Drive. Has Jack lost his mind?" The comments were a gold mine of suburban hysteria. "I heard he used napalm," wrote a woman named Carol who lived 3 streets over. "My property value just plummeted 30% just looking at this photo," lamented a guy named Richard, whose profile picture was him holding a golf club. "Is this a gang sign?" asked someone entirely divorced from reality. I sat back in my chair, eating a sandwich, just scrolling through the sheer panic. I didn't engage. I didn't reply. I just let them whip themselves into a frenzy. It was glorious. They were doing exactly what I wanted. They were documenting the extreme visibility of the numbers. Every time someone complained about how impossible the numbers were to ignore, they were legally reinforcing my defense under the International Fire Code. They were building my case for me, one terrified, capitalized comment at a time. At 4 p.m., I heard a sharp, aggressive knock on my front door. It wasn't the polite tap of a delivery driver. It was the frantic pounding of a process server. I walked to the foyer and opened the door. There was nobody there. But taped to the center of the door, right at eye level, was a thick, bright red envelope. I peeled it off, the adhesive ripping loudly in the quiet entryway. I didn't even need to open it to know what it was, but I tore the flap anyway. It was a mandatory summons to an emergency disciplinary tribunal. The language was so incredibly self-important, it read like a treason charge from the 17th century. It commanded my immediate presence at the Whispering Pines clubhouse at 7 p.m. that evening. The list of alleged violations was a solid block of text spanning 2 pages. They had thrown everything at the wall. Malicious destruction of visual harmony. Unauthorized and severe modification of topological assets. Willful endangerment of property values. Vandalism of the community aesthetic. At the very bottom, bolded and underlined twice, was the proposed penalty, an immediate, non-negotiable fine of $10,000 for damages, plus the mandatory hiring of a board-approved landscaping firm to completely resod my front lawn at my own expense. $10,000. Over house numbers. I couldn't help it. I laughed out loud, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings of my entryway. They were doubling down. They were so blinded by their own rage that they completely ignored the fire marshal's ruling. They honestly believed their private, spiral-bound book of covenants carried more weight than municipal law. I had 3 hours to prepare. I didn't need it. but I wanted the presentation to be flawless. I printed out 5 copies of the International Fire Code section 505.1. I printed out 5 copies of the preemption doctrine legal precedent in North Carolina, highlighting the exact sentences where state safety codes legally override HOA rules. I printed out the HOA's own bylaw, Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 2, in massive 72-point font. Then I went upstairs, took a shower, and put on a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. If I was going to court, even a fake suburban one smelling of potpourri, I was going to look the part. I wanted to look completely, terrifyingly calm. At 6:50 p.m., I walked out of my front door. The sun was starting to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the scorched black earth of my lawn. The numbers 208 looked even more menacing in the twilight. I walked down the sidewalk toward the clubhouse. The neighborhood was dead quiet, but I could feel the eyes on me. Blinds twitched, curtains fluttered. Everyone knew where I was going. The parking lot of the clubhouse was completely full. The board had clearly mobilized their base. When I pulled open the heavy double doors, a wall of hushed, angry whispers washed over me. The lobby was packed with residents. These were the true believers, the people who genuinely thought grass length was a measure of moral character. The meeting was being held in the main banquet hall. A long table had been set up at the front of the room, draped in a burgundy tablecloth. Seated behind it were the 5 members of the HOA Board of Directors. Brenda sat dead center. She had changed clothes. She was now wearing a sharp, dark navy blazer. She looked like she was preparing to deliver a State of the Union address declaring war. To her left was Cary, a retired accountant who treated the HOA budget like it was the gold reserve at Fort Knox. To her right was Helen, a woman whose entire personality was based on maintaining the neighborhood's seasonal flower arrangements. There was a single folding chair positioned in the exact center of the room, facing the long table. It was surrounded by rows of chairs filled with angry residents. It looked like an interrogation setup from a bad spy movie. I walked down the center aisle, my dress shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. The whispers died down as I passed. People literally leaned away from me, as if I might suddenly pull out another flamethrower and vaporize the fake ficus plants in the corner. I didn't sit in the folding chair. I stood directly behind it, resting my hands casually on the top of the plastic backrest. I looked directly at Brenda. "Good evening, board," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "I received your urgent invitation. What seems to be the emergency?" Brenda glared at me, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might shatter. She picked up a wooden gavel. She actually owned a wooden gavel, and slammed it down onto a small block of wood on the table. "This emergency tribunal of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now in session," Brenda announced, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "We are here to address the unprecedented, malicious, and frankly terrifying actions of the resident at 208 Oak Creek Drive." She picked up the 2-page list of charges and began reading them out loud. She read every single word. She dragged it out, emphasizing the phrases visual harmony and property values as if they were sacred texts. The crowd behind me murmured in agreement at all the right pauses. It was a well-rehearsed performance. "The board has reviewed the devastating damage inflicted upon the property," Brenda concluded, slapping the paper down. "We have determined that this act of blatant vandalism cannot go unpunished. The proposed penalty is $10,000, payable immediately, and a mandatory, board-managed remediation of the topological assets. She looked up at me, a smug, triumphant smirk finally returning to her face. She thought she had won. She thought the sheer weight of the crowd and the formal setting would intimidate me into submission. "How do you plead, Jack?" she demanded. "Do you accept the ruling of this board, or do we proceed to immediate property liens?" I slowly picked up the manila folder I had brought with me and unclasped the flap. "I don't plead anything, Brenda," I said calmly, "because to plead implies you have jurisdiction over this matter, which, legally speaking, you do not." A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd behind me. Gary, the retired accountant, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Excuse me," Gary said, his voice a nasally whine. "We are the board of directors. We hold absolute jurisdiction over all exterior modifications within the boundaries of Whispering Pines. You signed the covenant." "I did sign the covenant, Gary," I agreed cheerfully. "And I am a man who respects the written rule of law. In fact, I am a firm believer in the legal concept of strict textualism. I believe we must follow the exact, literal wording of the rules as they are written, regardless of intent. Wouldn't you agree?" Gary blinked, clearly not expecting me to agree with him. "Well, yes. The rules are the rules." "Excellent," I said. I pulled out the piece of paper with the 72-point font and walked forward, placing it directly in front of Gary. "Could you read that out loud for the room, Gary? It's Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 2 of our beloved covenant." Gary looked at the paper. He looked at Brenda, who was staring at me with extreme suspicion. "Read it, Gary," I prompted gently. Gary cleared his throat. "Address numbers must be displayed on the primary dwelling facade or integrated into the front landscaping." "Thank you," I said, turning back to face the entire board. "Yesterday morning, Brenda issued me a $500 fine because my brass numbers were slightly oxidized and in an Arial font. She demanded immediate rectification. She demanded the numbers be clearly visible. So I complied." "You burned your lawn to a crisp," Helen shrieked from the end of the table, her hands clutching her pearl necklace. "You made our street look like a war zone." "I integrated my address numbers into the front landscaping," I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I utilized a subtractive landscaping technique to permanently embed the numerical identification into the soil. Let's break this down. Is grass part of the landscaping?" Silence. "I'll answer for you. Yes, grass is universally defined as landscaping," I continued, pacing slowly in front of their table. "Are the numbers 2, 0, and 8 integrated into that grass?" "Yes. The shapes are physically cut into the organic matter. Therefore, I followed the exact literal text of Section 8, Article 3, Paragraph 2. "This is absurd!" Brenda yelled, slamming her hand on the table. "That rule was meant for placing a decorative rock in a flower bed, not using a commercial flamethrower on a residential lawn. It violates the spirit of the covenant. It violates the aesthetic harmony rules." "Ah," I said, raising a finger in the air. "The spirit of the covenant. Unfortunately, Brenda, in contract law, the explicit text overrides the unwritten spirit. The board failed to define the methods, materials, or size limits for landscaping integration. That is a drafting error on your part. I simply operated within the massive loophole you provided." "It doesn't matter," Brenda snapped, her face turning red again. "Section 1 of the covenant states that all properties must maintain a harmonious, uniform, and aesthetically pleasing appearance. A giant black scar on your lawn is a severe violation of Section 1. The $10,000 fine stands." "I'm so glad you brought up aesthetics, Brenda," I said, feeling the adrenaline really start to pump now. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The trap was fully set. It was time to drop the anvil. I pulled out the copies of the International Fire Code and the Preemption Doctrine legal precedent. I walked over and dropped a stack in front of each board member. "What is this?" Cary asked, looking at the dense legal text with disdain. "That," I said, stepping back, "is the law. Actual municipal and state law, not clubhouse rules." I turned to address the crowd behind me as well as the board. When Brenda decided to weaponize the rules against my font choice, she cited safety. She claimed the numbers needed to be pristine for emergency visibility. So I took her concerns very seriously. I researched the Cary Municipal Code regarding premises identification. I found International Fire Code Section 505.1. I pointed at the papers in front of Brenda. As you can read, the code mandates that address numbers must be plainly legible, visible from the street, and contrast heavily with their background. The city code does not care about serif fonts. It does not care about brass polish. It cares about high visibility contrast. "This means nothing," Brenda scoffed, pushing the paper away. "Our HOA covenant is a legally binding contract. We can set stricter aesthetic standards than the city." "You can," I agreed, "unless those aesthetic standards conflict with a public safety code. Which brings us to the second document I handed you, the Preemption Doctrine." I leaned over the table, looking directly into Brenda's eyes. I dropped my voice, letting the absolute certainty of my position sink in. The Preemption Doctrine dictates that when a higher governmental authority, like a state or city, passes a law regarding public safety, it legally overrides and nullifies any conflicting rules made by a lower authority, like a homeowners association. Brenda stared at me. The cogs were turning, but they were grinding against the sheer force of her denial. "Are you trying to tell me," Brenda said slowly, "that burning your lawn is a matter of public safety?" "I don't have to tell you that," I smiled. "The fire marshal already did." I pulled out the final piece of paper from my folder. It was a copy of the official incident report filed by Marshal Henderson that afternoon. I had driven down to the firehouse and requested a copy an hour before the meeting. "I have here the official, signed report from the Cary Fire Department," I said, holding the paper up. "Following the frantic and frankly illegal 911 call made by our president this morning, Marshal Henderson inspected my property." I quote from his official report. "The premise identification at 2008 Oak Creek Drive utilizes high-contrast subtractive landscaping that exceeds minimum visibility requirements. The property is in full compliance with IFC 505.1, resulting in optimal emergency identification conditions." I tossed the report onto the center of the table. "If you find me $10,000 for my lawn," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room, "you are officially fining a resident for complying with state fire codes. You are placing your private aesthetic covenant above emergency public safety laws. That is a direct violation of the Preemption Doctrine." I let the silence hang for a solid 5 seconds. I watched the realization wash over the board. Cary looked terrified. Helen looked like she was going to faint. Even Brenda's face had gone slack. "If you levy this fine," I continued, lowering the hammer, "I will not pay it. I will immediately file a lawsuit against the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association and against each of you individually as board members for illegal enforcement of an overridden covenant, harassment, and deliberate interference with municipal emergency codes. I will subpoena the fire marshal to testify that my lawn is the safest in the neighborhood. I will drag this board through years of litigation, and when I win, and I will win, the legal fees will completely bankrupt the HOA reserve fund." I looked at Gary, the accountant. Gary, how much is in the legal defense fund? Gary swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Not enough for a protracted municipal lawsuit, he mumbled. Shut up, Gary, Brenda hissed. So, I said, taking a step back and buttoning my suit jacket. Here are your options. Option A. You attempt to fine me, I sue you, the city backs me up, you lose everything, and Whispering Pines goes bankrupt over a font choice. Option B. You drop the $10,000 fine, you drop the original $500 fine, and we agree that my 12-foot scorched earth numbers are a permanent, unalterable fixture of the neighborhood's emergency infrastructure. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit on the roof. The crowd of residents behind me didn't make a sound. The show of absolute, unapologetic, legally bulletproof force had completely stunned them. They had never seen anyone stand up to Brenda, let alone back her into a corner she couldn't bureaucratic her way out of. Brenda looked down at her hands. She looked at the wooden gavel. She looked at the stack of legal precedents sitting in front of her. For the first time since I had moved into Whispering Pines, she looked small. She had tried to wield the rulebook like a weapon, but I had brought a legal bazooka to the fight. She took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a moment. The board, Brenda said, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant edge, will enter into immediate executive session to discuss the legal implications of this development. I think we can skip the executive session, Brenda, Gary interjected quickly, clearly terrified of the financial ruin I had just threatened. He looked at the other board members. Helen nodded frantically. The other two members murmured their agreement. Gary looked at me. The board moves to dismiss all fines against the property at 208 Oak Creek Drive, citing the unique application of municipal safety codes. Seconded, Helen practically gasped. Brenda looked at Gary with absolute betrayal, but she knew she was beaten. She had lost the board. She had lost the room. She picked up the wooden gavel, her hand shaking slightly, and tapped it against the block of wood. It sounded weak, defeated. Fines dismissed, Brenda whispered. Meeting adjourned. She didn't wait for anyone to get up. She shoved her chair back, grabbed her clipboard, and practically ran out the side door of the banquet hall. I stood there for a moment, letting the reality of the victory wash over me. I had won. I had beaten the HOA at their own game. I reached down, picked up my manila folder, and turned around to face the crowd. Nobody made eye contact with me. As I walked back down the center aisle, the angry residents parted like the Red Sea. They stepped out of my way, their expressions a mix of awe, horror, and profound confusion. I walked out the heavy double doors, out into the warm evening air, and took a deep breath. Walking back to my house, the neighborhood felt different. It was still perfectly manicured. The lawns were still mathematically green, but the spell of absolute terrified compliance had been broken. When I reached my driveway, I stopped and looked at my front lawn. The massive, pitch-black numbers 208 stood out in sharp, aggressive contrast against the twilight grass. They were an eyesore. They were an absolute disaster for the neighborhood's visual harmony, and they were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. So, if your HOA ever decides to go on a power trip because your mailbox doesn't look like it belongs in a museum, just remember, they rely on your fear of their fake authority. They rely on you assuming they know what they are talking about. But the moment you actually read the rules, the moment you force them to reconcile their petty aesthetics with actual real-world laws, their power evaporates. They wanted clear identification, I gave them a monument visible from space, and there wasn't a single thing they could do about it.